He didn't yell. He didn't call for the manager. He simply opened his phone, took one photograph, and sent a single email that would erase 15 years of a woman's career before the plane even touched the ground. The man in seat 2A looked like he didn't belong in first class, worn hoodie, scuffed sneakers, a child's crayon drawing, folded in his breast pocket. But that moldy tray of food wasn't just an insult. It was the last mistake Sandra Holloway would ever make in a uniform. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss a single chapter of what happens next. The lid hit the tray table with a soft metallic click. James Calloway didn't flinch. He didn't gag. He didn't reach up and stab the call button above his head the way any reasonable person might after lifting the cover off a first-class meal and being greeted by the unmistakable greenish-gray bloom of mold crawling across what was supposed to be roasted chicken. He just sat there, still, quiet. The way a man sits when he has already decided exactly what he is going to do next, and he's in no rush at all to do it. He was 44 years old, though most people who met him casually guessed older, not because he looked worn down, but because there was a heaviness to him that came from somewhere real. From working 20-hour days in a warehouse in his mid-20s. From sitting in a hospital hallway at 31, while his wife slipped away from a pulmonary embolism 36 hours after giving birth to their daughter. From raising that daughter Lily, now 12, entirely on his own, through broken-down cars and missed school plays, and nights he sat at the kitchen table long after she'd gone to sleep, staring at spreadsheets and trying to figure out how to keep everything from collapsing. He wore a gray Carhartt hoodie, dark joggers, a pair of New Balance shoes that had seen better days. Around his neck, no jewelry. On his wrist, no watch. The only thing that might have given someone pause if they'd looked closely enough was the phone in his hand, matte black, the kind that didn't come in a retail store, and the quiet, deliberate way his thumb moved across the screen. He was in seat 2A, first class, New York to Los Angeles. Pacific Crown Airlines Flight 887. He had booked the ticket not for himself, but because he'd planned to use the flight to finalize paperwork for the largest acquisition his company had ever attempted. He needed space, quiet, and a working tray table. He had the space. He had the quiet. What he did not have was edible food. The chicken, if that's what it had been, was greenish at the edges, slimy beneath the glaze that was supposed to make it look appetizing. The spinach beside it had collapsed into something dark and wet, the kind of wet that had nothing to do with steam and everything to do with days of neglect. He could smell it. Not overpoweringly, it hit you in the back of the throat, subtle the way rot always is when it's trying to hide beneath a nice presentation. James looked at the meal for 4 full seconds. Then he reached into his hoodie pocket, took out his phone, and began photographing. He photographed the tray from above, then from the side. He zoomed in on the mold along the bone. He tilted the tray slightly to catch the light and documented the discoloration in the spinach. He was methodical about it, the way a man photographs a car accident for insurance purposes, not emotionally, just carefully. Because details matter, and you never know which one will become important later. He did not raise his hand. He did not call for anyone. He simply documented, and then he opened his email. Sandra Holloway had been a flight attendant for Pacific Crown Airlines for 16 years. 15 of those years on the New York to LA route, which she treated less like a job and more like a kingdom. She knew every regular. She knew which flight attendants were worth working with and which ones she'd spent years maneuvering out of her section. She knew how to read a first-class cabin the way a card player reads a poker table, who had money, who was pretending, who was going to be difficult, and who could be managed with a smile and a refill. She spotted James Calloway the moment he settled into 2A, and she had him categorized before the boarding door closed. He didn't carry a briefcase. He wasn't wearing a suit. He didn't have that particular brand of self-assured arrogance that she'd come to associate with the men who belonged in first class. The ones who flagged you down for a second scotch before the fasten seatbelt sign went off. Who name-dropped hotels and golf courses, who treated you like furniture, but tipped like royalty. This man just sat there looking at his phone, looking out the window, quiet and unremarkable in a way that Sandra found vaguely irritating. She leaned toward her colleague Denise in the galley before the meal service. "Seat 2A," she said, keeping her voice low and her expression professional. "How do you think he got up here?" Denise looked over her shoulder. "Upgrade?" "Has to be," Sandra said. "He's got that look. You know the look." Denise didn't answer that because she wasn't entirely comfortable with where that look was going. But Sandra didn't need her to answer. She'd already moved on, already decided. When the catering error was flagged in the galley, one of the new attendants discovered that several of the trays had been loaded incorrectly from a batch that had been held too long at the catering facility. Sandra made a swift, quiet decision. She redistributed the good trays to the passengers she deemed most likely to notice. She moved around 2A. "He probably won't say anything," she told herself. "His type never does." She couldn't have told you if pressed exactly what she meant by his type. She probably would have said, quiet, low-key, non-confrontational. She would have believed herself completely. She brought James his tray with a practiced smile, set it down, lifted the lid for him the way they'd been trained. She saw the mold. She didn't react. Not externally. She said, "Enjoy your meal," and turned away. James looked up from the tray. He watched Sandra Holloway's back as she walked toward the galley. Straight-shouldered, unhurried, the walk of someone who has made a calculation and is satisfied with the result. He looked back at the food. He thought about Lily. He thought about how she always said, "Daddy, you never complain about anything," in a tone that was half admiration and half worry, as if she'd somehow figured out at 12 years old that not complaining and not caring were two very different things. He picked up his phone. He dialed a number from memory, not texting, dialing the way men of a certain generation still do when something is serious enough to require a voice. It rang twice. "Robert," James said when the line connected. Calm, even. "It's Callaway. I'm on 887 right now, about 2 hours out of New York." A pause. "I've got something you need to see. Check your email in 60 seconds. He hung up before Robert Hale, the CEO of Pacific Crown Airlines, a man who had spent the last 8 months negotiating the terms of what would be the largest freight acquisition in the industry's recent history, with James's company, Apex Freight Systems, could respond. James attached the photos. He attached the short video clip he'd taken that showed the meal from multiple angles, including one that made the mold undeniably, inescapably visible. He wrote 4 sentences in the body of the email. Clean, direct, no drama. "Robert, this was served to me in first class approximately 12 minutes ago. The flight attendant saw the condition of the food before she walked away. I'm not raising this with the crew. I'll see you when we land." He sent it. Then he folded the tray lid back over the food, slid the tray to the side, reached into his carry-on, and took out the protein bar he always kept there because Lily had told him 3 years ago on a flight back from a logistics conference, "Daddy, airline food is disgusting. You should always bring a backup." He'd laughed at her then. He unwrapped the bar. He ate it. He returned to his paperwork. Sandra Holloway did not think about seat 2A again for the better part of an hour. She was busy, genuinely busy, the way the LA route always was, managing drinks and requests, and the particular neediness of the first-class cabin that she usually found energizing, because it reminded her she was good at her job. She was good at her job. That part was real. She could handle anything: turbulence, delayed meals, the passenger who'd had too much to drink in the lounge and needed careful management. She had skills. 16 years of them. Around the 90-minute mark, she walked past 2A and noticed the tray had been set aside. The food was untouched under the lid. The man in the seat was reading through a stack of printed documents with a red pen, making notes in small, precise handwriting. Something flickered at the edge of her awareness. A small discomfort she couldn't quite name. She moved on. At the 2-hour mark on her break in the back galley, she opened her personal phone out of habit and navigated to her Facebook. It was something she did without thinking: scroll, post, react. She'd had the account for 11 years and treated it like a private journal that happened to be visible to 460 people. She posted, "First class is something else today, lol. Some people really don't know where they belong. Serving spoiled food to Mr. Hoodie and he didn't even notice. My job is too easy sometimes." She put the phone away and went back to work. She did not in that moment consider that her page was public. She had never considered it in 11 years. It had never mattered before. The last 40 minutes of the flight were uneventful. James Calloway did not flag Sandra Holloway down. He did not ask for a replacement meal. He did not request to speak with a supervisor. He answered 2 emails, reviewed the final section of the acquisition documents, and spent the last 20 minutes of the flight with his eyes closed. Not sleeping. Just still the way he got when he was thinking through something that required complete attention. When the plane began its descent into LAX, he capped his red pen, organized his documents back into his carry-on, and reached into the outer pocket of the bag to check something. Then he leaned his head back and looked out the window at the pale sprawl of Los Angeles spreading out below him the way it always did in the late afternoon, all that light and distance. He thought about Lily. She was staying with his sister this week. He always called her the minute he landed every trip without fail. He thought about Robert Hale and the email he'd sent and what came next. He felt no anger. He hadn't felt angry since about 30 seconds after the lid came off that tray, when the anger rose and then passed through him the way it always did, now fast and clean, leaving nothing behind but clarity. Lily had said it once watching him handle a difficult phone call with a supplier who'd tried to cut corners on a shipment. "Why don't you yell at him, Daddy? He's lying." "I know he's lying," James had said, "and yelling would make me feel better for about 30 seconds. But this..." He'd held up the paper trail he'd been quietly building for 6 weeks. "This makes it impossible for him to do it again." She'd thought about that for a while. Then she'd said, "That's scarier." He'd smiled. "Yeah, baby, it is." The plane touched down at 4:47 p.m. Pacific Time. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, James Calloway turned his phone off airplane mode. The notifications came in 17 of them in the 90 seconds it took the phone to reconnect. 12 were from Robert Hale's office. 4 were from his own executive assistant. 1 was from a number he didn't recognize, which turned out to be Robert Hale's personal cell, a number that very few people had, with a message that read, "James, I saw it. I'm at the gate. We need to talk before anything else happens." R. James read the message. "Read it again." He typed back, "See you in 5 minutes." He stood when the seatbelt sign went off. He reached up for his carry-on with one hand. He straightened his hoodie with the other. Around him, the first-class cabin shuffled and gathered and moved in the way that people move when they're eager to be somewhere else. Sandra Holloway was positioned at the front of the cabin near the exit door, the way she always was during deplaning, smiling and saying goodbye with practiced warmth. She said goodbye to the man in 2A, the way she said goodbye to everyone automatically, professionally, as if the transaction were complete. She didn't notice the 2 men in suits standing just beyond the jetway door. She didn't notice the Pacific Crown executive badge clipped to the jacket of the taller one. She didn't notice that the quiet man in the Carhartt hoodie walked directly toward them, and that the taller man reached out to shake his hand, and that the other man opened a laptop right there in the terminal corridor, and that all 3 of them leaned in close. She was already thinking about the drive home. Traffic on the 405. Maybe takeout from the Thai place on Culver. She had 11 minutes left before she would find out that the world had already changed while she was thinking about pad thai. Chen. Robert Hale shook James Calloway's hand, the way men shake hands when they've been through something together, even if one of them did it 35,000 feet in the air and alone. "I've already called legal," Robert said. His voice was tight, controlled. The voice of a man who has run a publicly traded airline for 6 years and knows how to manage a crisis without adding to it. "And I've called the catering facility. This is James. I need you to understand how seriously—" "I know you do," James said. "That's why I called you and not a reporter." Robert stopped, looked at him. "I appreciate that." "Don't appreciate it yet," James said. "There's more." He nodded to the man beside Robert, who turned the laptop to show him the screenshot. Sandra Holloway's Facebook post. Public. Still live. Robert Hale read it. He read it again. His jaw moved slightly the way jaws do when a man is choosing very carefully not to say the first thing that comes to mind. "She knew," James said quietly. "She saw the food before she walked away from the tray. That's not a catering error anymore, Robert. That's a decision." Robert straightened. He looked down the jetway toward the aircraft. He looked back at James. "I need to make a call," Robert said. "Take your time," James said. "I've got a call to make too." He stepped a few feet away, turned his back on the terminal, and dialed his sister's number. It rang once. "Hey," he said when she picked up. "Can I talk to her?" A pause. Then a small voice, loud the way 12-year-olds are always loud on the phone, full of news and questions, and the complete confidence that the person on the other end wants to hear all of it immediately. "Daddy, Aunt C let me make pancakes for dinner, and I put chocolate chips in them, and also I drew you something, and also how was your flight?" James Calloway stood in the terminal at LAX in his worn Carhartt hoodie, with an acquisition document in his carry-on that was about to reshape the airline industry, and he smiled for the first time since he'd boarded that flight in New York. "The flight was fine, baby," he said. "I'll tell you about it when I get home. Show me the drawing when I get there." "Okay. Love you, Daddy." "Love you too." He hung up. Turned back to Robert Hale, who was still on his own call, face unreadable, but posture rigid. James picked up his carry-on. He waited. Somewhere behind him in the now emptying cabin, Sandra Holloway began the post-flight check, moving row by row, collecting forgotten items and straightening headrests, completely unaware that the two men standing 40 feet away in the terminal corridor were deciding the rest of her life. She picked up a crayon drawing from the seat pocket in 2A. A little girl's drawing in blue and green and orange. A man and a child holding hands, standing in front of what might have been a plane, or might have been a house. In a child's handwriting at the top, Daddy's work trip. Come home soon. Sandra looked at it for a second. Then she placed it in the lost and found bag and moved on to the next row. Robert Hale ended his call with 4 words. "Do it. Do it now." He slid the phone into his jacket pocket and walked back toward James with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who had just made a decision he couldn't unmake and had fully accepted that fact. There was something almost military about it, the set of his jaw, the way he didn't look around the terminal, the way most people do when they're nervous, when they're searching for exits or reassurance. Robert looked straight ahead, straight at James. "Security is pulling her aside before she leaves the terminal," he said. "HR is being patched in by phone. Our legal team is already flagging the post. It's been screenshotted and preserved. She hasn't deleted it." "She doesn't know to delete it yet," James said. "No." Robert exhaled slowly through his nose. "She doesn't." James nodded once. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't satisfied in the way a man is satisfied when he's beaten someone. He was just watching the way he'd watched 1,000 moments in 20 years of building a company, alert, clear-eyed, waiting for the next thing that needed a decision. "I want to be clear about something," James said. "This isn't personal for me." Robert looked at him. "I know. I mean it. I don't want her prosecuted because I was insulted. I want her held accountable because she made a choice. She saw that food, Robert. She stood right there, and she saw it, and she made a calculation. And that calculation said that the man in that seat was not worth worrying about. He paused. That kind of judgment that's not a bad day. That's a habit. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 16 years. Yeah. And she posted it publicly, while the flight was still in the air. While the flight was still in the air, James confirmed. On a public page. Robert rubbed the back of his neck. I've got a board meeting on Friday. This acquisition is still happening, James said, unless you give me a reason to think differently. He let that sit for exactly 1 second, then added, I didn't call you because I wanted leverage. I called you because I thought you deserved to know what was happening on your own airline before it became someone else's headline. Robert Hale looked at James Calloway. Really looked at him the way people rarely look at each other in business, which was directly and without performance, and said, most people in your position would have gone straight to the press. I'm not most people, James said. I've got a 12-year-old who reads the news. Something in Robert's expression shifted slightly. Not softened exactly, but moved the way a very controlled face moves when something lands unexpectedly close to something real. I have one of those too, Robert said. 13. Then you understand, James said, that they're watching everything we do. Robert nodded. He straightened his jacket. He said, I'll need your formal statement before end of day. You'll have it, James said. Send me the form. They shook hands again, and this time it was different from the first, less introduction, more agreement. The kind of handshake that closes something. James picked up his carry-on and walked toward the rideshare exit. He did not look back toward the gate. He didn't need to. Sandra Holloway had 14 steps left in her post-flight check when she felt the shift. She couldn't have named it. It was just a change in the air of the jetway. The way two people standing near the gate door suddenly became very still when she appeared. The way one of them spoke quietly into an earpiece. The way the other one looked at her with an expression that was professionally blank in the particular way that meant something was very wrong. She stopped. Ms. Holloway. The man nearest to her mid-30s Pacific Crown badge, a name she didn't recognize, stepped forward. Could you come with us, please? She felt her stomach drop the way it does in an elevator that moves too fast. I'm still finishing my check. It can wait, he said. Please. The word please was doing a lot of work. It was technically polite, but it wasn't a request. She followed them. Through the gate door, through the terminal, past the rows of departures and arrivals, past the coffee kiosks, and the families with rolling luggage into a corridor she'd walked 100 times, but never noticed, could feel this narrow. They brought her into a small conference room near the Pacific Crown Ground Operations Office, a room she recognized. She'd seen disciplinary meetings happen in rooms like this. She'd never been in one herself. There were 3 people already seated at the table. One was from HR. She recognized the woman Kathleen Marsh, Senior HR Director, whom Sandra had spoken to exactly once 3 years ago over a scheduling dispute that had been resolved in Sandra's favor. Kathleen was not smiling. There was a man Sandra didn't recognize who introduced himself as being from the airline's legal team. He said his name clearly and precisely, and then immediately said nothing else, which was somehow worse than if he had kept talking. There was a laptop open on the table screen facing outward. Sandra looked at the screen. The screenshot of her Facebook post looked enormous on that screen. The words she had typed 30,000 feet in the air on her break, half thinking about takeout food, filled the space between her and the people across the table like something solid, like a wall she had built herself and then walked directly into. First class is something else today, LOL. Some people really don't know where they belong. Serving spoiled food to Mr. Hoodie, and he didn't even notice. My job is too easy sometimes. She read it the way you read something you wrote, seeing both what it says and all the things you meant and didn't mean and thought were private, even though they weren't, and feeling the specific horror of those two things existing in the same sentence. She started. Ms. Holloway, Kathleen said. Before you say anything, I want to make sure you understand the scope of this conversation. This is not an informal check-in. This meeting is being documented. You have the right to request union representation before we proceed." Sandra's mouth was dry. "I understand," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Then let's begin," Kathleen said. "Can you tell us about the meal served to the passenger in seat 2A on flight 887 this afternoon?" Sandra looked at the post on the screen. She looked at Kathleen. She thought briefly about lying, about saying she hadn't known, about blaming catering, about constructing something clean and defensible. She had 16 years of experience managing difficult conversations in pressurized environments. She was good at staying calm. But the post was on the screen, her words, her account, her public page. "There was a catering error," she said carefully. "Some of the trays from this flight were flagged as potentially compromised. I was made aware during the galley check before service." "And what did you do with that information?" Kathleen asked. Sandra paused. "I redistributed the available unaffected trays to other passengers." "All other passengers." Another pause. The kind of pause that answers its own question. "No," she said. "Who didn't receive a replacement tray?" Sandra looked at the post again. Then she stopped looking at it. "The passenger in 2A." "Why?" She wanted to say she didn't know. She wanted to say it was an oversight, a mistake, a logistical error in the chaos of a mid-flight service. All of those things would have been easier to say and easier to absorb for both herself and the people across the table, and they would have all been wrong. "I made a judgment call," she said. The legal counsel, who had not moved or changed expression since his initial introduction, wrote something down. "Can you tell us more about that judgment call?" Kathleen said. Sandra stopped, started again. "I assessed the passenger as unlikely to escalate." The sentence left her mouth and immediately became something heavier than she'd intended, the way certain sentences do when you hear them out loud and realize they sound exactly like what they are. "Unlikely to escalate," Kathleen repeated. Not a question. An echo. The kind of echo that turns a phrase over so everyone in the room can look at it from all sides. "Yes," Sandra said. "Based on what?" The room was very quiet. The legal counsel's pen didn't move. Kathleen waited. Sandra Holloway had been in difficult conversations before. She'd dealt with irate passengers at gate doors and in the aisle and in the galley. She'd filed incident reports and union grievances and scheduling complaints. She knew how to hold a position, but she had never sat in a room before with three people who had already seen what she'd written, who knew what she'd done and why she'd done it, and who were now asking her calmly, professionally, without accusation, to say the quiet part out loud. "I don't have a good answer for that," she said finally. It was the most honest thing she'd said since she walked into the room. Kathleen wrote something on her notepad. "The passenger in 2A, she said. "Do you know who he is?" "No," Sandra said. And then, because the way Kathleen asked it made the back of her neck go cold, "Should I?" Kathleen folded her hands on the table. She looked at Sandra Holloway with the expression of someone who is not unkind, but has a job to do, and is going to do it completely regardless. "His name is James Calloway," Kathleen said. "He is the founder and CEO of Apex Freight Systems. His company has been in acquisition negotiations with Pacific Crown Airlines for approximately 8 months. The deal, if finalized, is valued at approximately $2.3 billion. The number landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Sandra heard it. She understood it grammatically. It took several additional seconds for it to translate into something her mind could actually process, to move from the sound of the words to the weight of what they meant, and then from that weight to the specific nauseating understanding of what she had done, and who she had done it to, and why she had believed she could. "He contacted the CEO of Pacific Crown before the flight landed," Kathleen continued. "He sent photographs and video documentation of the meal. He did not post anything publicly or contact the press. He gave us the opportunity to address this internally." A pause. "Which we are now doing," Sandra said nothing. Your Facebook post. The legal counsel said, speaking for the first time in 15 minutes, his voice dry, precise. The voice of a man who measures words like they cost something. Was captured before you had an opportunity to delete it. It was shared 11 times in the 40 minutes between your posting it and this meeting. It is currently being discussed on 3 separate aviation industry forums. He paused. One of them is verified. Sandra felt the blood leave her face. The post makes specific reference to the passenger and the food, he continued. It is public. It is attributed to your verified account, which lists Pacific Crown Airlines as your employer. Under Section 7.4 of your Employee Conduct Agreement, social media posts that bring the airline into disrepute or reveal proprietary service information. I know what 7.4 says, Sandra said. Her voice was hollow. Then you understand our position, he said. She understood their position. She understood it with perfect clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes when all the exits close at once, when the choices you made an hour ago arrive at the door of where you are sitting right now, and they don't knock. They just walk in. 16 years, she said, not really to anyone in the room, more to herself. To the version of herself that had typed those words on her break, half smiling, not thinking, not considering for a single second that the man in the hoodie could be anyone other than what she'd decided he was. Yes, Kathleen said quietly. 16 years. James Calloway was in the back of a rideshare somewhere on the 105 when his executive assistant Priya called him for the second time. It's spreading, she said without preamble, because Priya had worked for him for 7 years and had long since abandoned the practice of leading with pleasantries when something required directness. The Facebook post, it's being picked up. Aviation Week's social team already has it. I'm seeing chatter on LinkedIn. How long before it hits mainstream? James asked. Depending on who picks it up, 4 hours. Maybe less if a verified account amplifies it. James looked out the window at the highway. Late afternoon LA traffic. The sky was that particular shade of orange that only exists on certain Southern California evenings, the kind Lily had once described as the sky being embarrassed about something. Let it move, he said. You sure I can reach out to a few contacts? Priya, let it move. He said it gently but without ambiguity. I'm not interested in controlling the story. The story is what it is. A pause on her end. Okay. She shifted. The board meeting Friday. Still on. And the acquisition. James considered the question for a moment. Not because he was uncertain, but because it was a question that deserved actual consideration rather than a reflexive answer. He thought about Robert Hale's face in the terminal, the steadiness of it, the way he'd moved the moment he needed to move without deflection or excuse. He thought about the phone call Robert had made before James's rideshare had even left the curb. He thought about the way the man had said, I have one of those too, when James mentioned Lily with the particular compression of someone who actually understood what that meant. The acquisition is still on, James said. But I want a full audit of Pacific Crown's catering contracts included as a precondition to close, not as a punitive measure, as due diligence. I'll draft the amendment tonight, Priya said. Thank you. James. She paused again in the way she did when she was about to say something that wasn't strictly business. You okay? He thought about the tray, about the smell, about Sandra Holloway's straight back as she walked away, about the crayon drawing in the seat pocket, Lily's drawing, the one he'd tucked there weeks ago, and forgotten about the one that had probably been sitting in a lost and found bag for the past 30 minutes. Yeah, he said. I'm okay. Good. She was back to business immediately. Your amended contract draft will be in your inbox by 7. Don't ignore it this time. I never ignore your drafts. You ignored the last one for 9 days. I was thinking about it. For 9 days. I'm a deliberate person. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I'll see you Monday, James. See you Monday. He hung up, put the phone face down on his knee, watched the highway move past the window. He thought about calling Lily again just to hear her voice, and then decided to wait. He'd be at his sister's place in 40 minutes, and he'd rather see her face when he told her about the protein bar. She'd laugh. She'd say, "I told you." He'd let her have it because she deserved it. The driver, who had been silent for the entire ride, said, "You want the radio on?" "No," James said. "Thank you." "Long flight?" James smiled slightly. "Yeah, long flight." Back in the terminal conference room, the meeting was winding toward its conclusion, which was also the conclusion of Sandra Holloway's career at Pacific Crown Airlines. Kathleen Marsh had placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of Sandra. Sandra had looked at it without touching it for almost 30 seconds before she picked it up. It was a termination notice, effective immediately. "You'll be escorted to collect your personal belongings from the crew locker room," Kathleen said. "Your credentials will be deactivated as of this meeting. You'll receive formal written notification of the grounds for termination within 48 hours. "The union," Sandra started. "You are entitled to file a grievance through your union," Kathleen said. "That process is outlined in your employee handbook, and we will not interfere with it. However, given the documentation, we have the catering incident, the public post, the passenger statement, and your own acknowledgement in this meeting of the reasoning behind your service decisions. I want to be honest with you, Ms. Holloway. The union will have a difficult case." Sandra put the paper back on the table. She smoothed the edge of it with her thumb, a small automatic gesture, the kind of thing hands do when a person needs to be doing something, but there is nothing left to do. 16 years. She'd served senators and athletes and film directors and foreign dignitaries. She'd handled medical emergencies and panic attacks, and a woman who'd gone into early labor somewhere over Kansas. She'd missed holidays and anniversaries and her nephew's first birthday because the schedule said she was in the air. She'd given 16 years to this job, and she had been genuinely good at most of it, genuinely skilled, genuinely competent. And none of that was wrong. But she had walked past a man's seat with spoiled food under a covered tray, and she had thought he won't notice, and she had been so sure of it that she'd announced it to 460 people on the internet while the wheels were still in the air. And the thing that kept pressing at the edges of her awareness, that she couldn't quite make herself look at directly, was this: she hadn't been wrong about the not noticing. He hadn't complained. He hadn't called for anyone. He'd sat there quietly in his hoodie and eaten a protein bar. She'd been catastrophically wrong about everything else. She signed the paper. She stood up. She said, "Can I ask one thing?" Kathleen looked at her. "Did he ask for this?" Sandra said. "The termination. Did he ask for it?" Kathleen considered for a moment. "He asked for accountability," she said. "He was specific that he wasn't interested in revenge." Sandra nodded slowly. She wasn't sure whether that made it better or worse. She decided it made it more honest, which was its own particular kind of harder. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. The security escort was waiting in the hallway. She had driven to the airport that morning in a car she'd paid off 6 months ago, listening to a podcast about investment strategies, drinking coffee from her good travel mug. She had been in every practical sense fine. She had been in every way she understood secure. She had been certain on some level she'd never examined that she could see who people were just by looking at them. That this skill, this ability to read a cabin, read a passenger, read a situation, that this was knowledge. The hallway was long. The security escort walked beside her without speaking. She thought about the man in the hoodie. She thought about what she'd written. She thought about the drawing she'd found in the seat pocket, that small blue and green drawing from a child tucked into the pocket of seat 2A. And she thought about the fact that she had put it in a bag without a second thought. And standing in that terminal hallway, walking toward the locker room and the parking lot, and whatever came after this, Sandra Holloway had a thought that arrived without drama, without fanfare, the way the most important thoughts always do. She thought, "I didn't even ask his name." She hadn't asked his name. She'd looked at him and decided everything she needed to know, and she'd been so thorough about deciding it that she'd never thought to ask a single question. And he, the man she'd dismissed, the man she'd served mold and spinach to, and then posted about on the internet, he hadn't needed to ask anything either. He'd just taken photographs and called a number from memory, and eaten a protein bar and waited. That was the part she couldn't shake. He had just waited. The thing about a story is that it doesn't wait for you to be ready. By 7 o'clock that evening, Sandra Holloway's Facebook post had been shared 412 times. By 8, it was on Twitter. By 9:30, a verified aviation journalist with 240,000 followers had quoted it with 3 words of commentary. "This is real." That was all it took. 3 words from the right account, and the thing Sandra had typed on her break. Half distracted, half amused, thinking about Thai food became something that lived in the open air of the internet, where it would never fully stop existing regardless of what happened next. She didn't know any of this yet. She was sitting in her car in the employee parking structure at LAX, still in her uniform, because she hadn't yet processed the fact that she was no longer permitted to wear it, holding her phone and staring at a screen that was filling up with notifications faster than she could read them. Comments on the post. Messages in her inbox. Friend requests from accounts she didn't recognize. Someone had tagged Pacific Crown Airlines' official account. Someone else had tagged a news aggregator. Someone she'd gone to high school with, a woman she hadn't spoken to in 20 years, had shared the post with the comment, "Oh no, Sandra." She opened her inbox. The first message was from her sister, "Call me. Right now. Please." The second was from a man she vaguely recognized as a former colleague who'd left Pacific Crown 4 years ago. "Take the post down. Take it down right now." The third was from an account she didn't recognize with no profile picture and a username made of random letters and numbers that read, "We know who he is." "Do you?" She stared at that third message for a long time. Then she went back to the post. She pressed delete. The platform asked her if she was sure. She confirmed. The post disappeared from her page, but Kathleen Marsh had told her the truth. It had already been screenshotted. It had already been shared. Deleting it from her own page was like trying to unring a bell by putting your hands over your ears. The sound was already in the room. The sound was already in 1,000 rooms. She put her phone face down on the passenger seat and pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way they'd been taught to manage in-flight stress during training 16 years ago in a classroom in Dallas with 30 other trainees who were all too young to understand that they were learning the skill not for passengers, but for themselves. Her phone buzzed against the seat. Buzzed again. Again. She didn't pick it up. She started the car. Priya called James at 7:43 with an update he hadn't asked for and didn't need to hear to already know. "It's moved," she said. Aviation Week ran a piece. They're calling it a catering scandal, but the social media angle is what's getting traction. The post, the dismissal confirmation, Pacific Crown's PR team issued a statement 20 minutes ago. What did the statement say? That Pacific Crown takes passenger safety and employee conduct to the highest standard, that an incident on Flight 887 is under active investigation, and that the airline is committed to full transparency. Priya paused. Boilerplate, but they got it out fast. Robert Hale's team is sharp. They are, James agreed. He was at his sister Carol's house by then, sitting at the kitchen table, while Lily showed him the pancakes she'd made, or rather the photograph of the pancakes, because they had been consumed hours ago, but the photographic evidence was thorough and enthusiastic. "Daddy, I put chocolate chips and also blueberries," Lily was saying, leaning over his arm to scroll through the photos on her tablet. "And Aunt C said I could make them again tomorrow if I clean the griddle myself, which I did look." She swiped to a photo of a very clean griddle. "That's a very clean griddle," James confirmed. "I know." She seemed satisfied with this. Then she looked at him sideways the way she did when she was deciding whether to ask something. Were you on the phone for work? Yeah. Is everything okay? He looked at his daughter, 12 years old, her mother's eyes, his mother's forehead, her own particular way of asking questions that sounded casual but weren't, and he said, "Everything's fine. It was a complicated flight." She accepted this with the quiet judgment of a child who has learned not to push, which was somehow both a relief and an ache. She hadn't learned it from any particular lesson. She'd learned it from watching him handle complicated things alone for as long as she could remember. "Go ahead," he said to Priya, who had been patient on the other end of the line. "I'll call you back in 10 minutes. He stepped out to the back porch. The LA evening was warm and smelled like the neighbor's jasmine. He stood there in his gray hoodie in the dark and called Priya back. "The legal exposure," he started. "Pacific Crown's or yours? Mine." "Minimal," she said immediately. "You didn't go to the press. You communicated directly with executive leadership. You have documentation of everything you sent and when. If anything, your conduct in this situation is going to look extraordinarily measured compared to what she posted publicly." A pause. "James, you could have leveled them. You didn't." "I know," he said. "The board will see that on Friday." "I know," he said again. He wasn't thinking about Friday. He was thinking about something else, something that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the terminal, since the handshake with Robert, since the rideshare on the 105. He was thinking about the fact that this was already bigger than he'd planned for it to be, and that the size of it had consequences he hadn't fully mapped out yet. He'd wanted accountability. He'd wanted the airline to know what had happened and to deal with it correctly. He had not wanted Sandra Holloway to become a nationally trending topic on aviation Twitter by 9 o'clock on a Tuesday. "Priya," he said, "has anyone asked for a comment from me directly? Any press?" 4 outlets so far. I've declined all of them." "Keep declining," he said. "If Robert's team asks about coordination, tell them we're not in competition with their statement. We're not commenting and we're not contradicting them." "Understood." "And Priya the woman, the flight attendant, anyone looking into her personally yet?" A beat of silence. "A few accounts on social media are trying to identify her by name." "I don't think they've gotten there yet. The post was tied to a personal account with her full name, but it's been deleted now." "If anyone calls you asking for confirmation of her name—" "I know," Priya said. "I won't confirm anything." "Thank you." He went back inside. Lily had moved from the kitchen to the couch and was doing homework with the television on in the background, which was a house rule violation she was brazenly attempting while Carol was in the other room. When she heard James come in, she reached for the remote without looking up and turned the TV off with the practiced innocence of someone who has done this many times. James sat down on the couch beside her. He looked at the homework. Fractions. She hated fractions. He'd once spent 45 minutes trying to explain equivalent denominators, using pizza as an example, and she'd said, "This is why I don't trust math," which was the funniest thing he'd ever heard a 10-year-old say. "How are the fractions?" he asked. "Terrible," she said. "They're all terrible. Every single one." "Want help?" She looked at him. "You're tired." "I'm fine." "Daddy?" She said it the way her mother used to say it, not a name, more of a full stop, a gentle correction, a refusal to be managed. "You do the thing where you say you're fine, and then you fall asleep on the couch." "1 time," he said. 5 times. He opened his mouth, then closed it because it was probably 5 times. "Do you want help with fractions or not?" She handed him the worksheet. He helped her with fractions. By the following morning, the story had a name. Not a name anyone had officially given it. That wasn't how these things worked. It was a name the internet gave. It assembled from the pieces that were available. The screenshotted post, the Aviation Week piece, a follow-up from a consumer airline watchdog blog, and most significantly, a photo that a passenger from Flight 887 had taken on their own phone during the meal service. Not of the food, but of Seat 2A. It was a blurry photo taken from across the aisle that showed the side of James Calloway's face, his hoodie, and the closed tray in front of him. The passenger had posted it the previous evening with a caption that said, "Was on this flight." This man ate a protein bar in first class, and I could see him taking notes on documents the whole time. He never said a word to anyone. Now I find out he owns the company trying to buy Pacific Crown, sir, respect. That post had 47,000 likes by morning. James found out about it when his sister came into the kitchen at 6:50 a.m., set her phone down on the table in front of him, and stood back with her arms crossed. He read the post, looked at the photo, looked at Carol. "Good morning to you, too," he said. James. Carol had 8 years on him, which she wielded with precision. "You are trending." "I know." "On the internet." "I know." "People are calling you, wait, let me find it." She reached for her phone and scrolled. "The most terrifying kind of calm. Someone else said you have CEO energy, so advanced it can only be perceived in retrospect. And someone from a place called Aviation Geeks United is calling you?" She squinted at the screen, a one-man catering regulatory body. James drank his coffee. "Does this bother you?" Carol asked. He thought about it honestly. "Not the way it probably should," he said. She sat down across from him. Carol had always been the talker between the two of them, the one who processed things out loud, while James processed things in long silence. She'd been the one who sat with him in the hospital the night Marie died, who talked for 3 hours straight, not about anything important, just talking, filling the silence, so it didn't crush him. He'd never told her how much that had mattered. He assumed she knew. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "About what?" "About the fact that your face is on the internet and the story is bigger than you expected." "Nothing," he said. "That's the answer. Nothing." She studied him. "You planned for this." "I planned for the airline to handle it properly," he said. "I didn't plan for a passenger to take a photo of me eating a protein bar and turn it into a thing." He paused. "But I don't control what other people do. I only control what I do." Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marie used to say that about you." He looked up. "She used to say you were the only person she knew who understood the difference between what you can control and what you can't." Carol's voice was careful in the way it always was when she brought Marie up, not avoiding it, but being precise the way you are with something valuable that can also break. She said it made her feel safe. James looked at his coffee cup. He thought about the crayon drawing in the seat pocket. He'd remembered it about an hour after landing and had called the airline's lost and found. The woman on the phone had been patient and thorough, and the drawing was supposedly being held at LAX's passenger services desk and would be mailed back to him within the week. It was just a drawing. Lily had made 100 like it, but it was also the one she'd tucked into his bag on Sunday morning when he was packing, when she thought he wasn't looking, because she always did that. On long trips slipped something small into his bag, so he'd find it and know she was thinking about him. "Yeah," he said. She said it made her feel safe. Lily came downstairs 40 minutes later in mismatched socks, carrying her backpack and the fraction worksheet which she had apparently finished at some point the previous evening. She dropped into the chair across from James and reached for the orange juice with the automatic ease of a child who knows exactly where she is in every house she visits regularly. "Aunt C showed me the internet thing," she said. James looked at Carol. Carol raised her hands. She was going to find it anyway. "You're trending, Daddy," Lily said. She sounded more curious than alarmed, which was either a sign of excellent adjustment or a sign that 12-year-olds today had a fundamentally different relationship to internet virality than anyone over 40 could fully comprehend. Probably both. "I know," he said. "Because of the moldy food. Because of the moldy food." She was quiet for a moment, pouring juice with great concentration. Then she looked up. Were you scared? He considered the question. Lily asked questions like that, direct, unexpected, aimed at the thing most people would orbit around. Another thing she'd gotten from her mother. No, he said. Not scared. More steady. Like when you're very clear on what the right thing to do is, and you just do it and everything else kind of quiets down. She thought about this. Like when I do the hard fractions first. Exactly like that. She seemed satisfied. She drank her juice. She said, I think what she did was wrong. He didn't ask her to clarify. It was. But also kind of sad. He looked at his daughter, 12 years old, eating cereal in mismatched socks in her aunt's kitchen, having apparently extracted more nuance from the situation than some of the adults who'd been in the terminal conference room yesterday. Yeah, he said. It's that too. Robert Hale called at 9:15. I assume you've seen the coverage, Robert said. I've seen some of it. It's accelerating. We've had calls from 3 major outlets this morning. Our PR team is managing, but... Robert stopped. James, people are starting to talk about the acquisition. Not just the catering incident, the whole thing. There are investors asking questions. My board is going to want a statement before Friday. What kind of statement? That the deal is still on the table. That this incident doesn't represent a fundamental breakdown in our corporate standards. That Pacific Crown has... Robert paused again. James could hear him choosing words with the care of a man who had been in boardrooms for 3 decades. That we are the kind of company that deserves to be acquired by your company. The sentence had cost him something. James understood that. It was not an easy sentence for the CEO of a publicly traded airline to say, and the fact that Robert Hale had said it directly without dressing it up told James something important. I'll give you the statement, James said, but I want to tell you something first. All right. I've been in rooms with a lot of executives in my career, James said. I've had deals fall apart over things smaller than this, and I've had deals survive things bigger. What I look for, the thing I actually look for before numbers, before market position, before route maps and fleet analysis, is whether the person running the company acts like someone who understands that everything they do has consequences for the people they don't see. Robert was quiet. Yesterday you were at the gate, James said. Before you knew the full scope of it, before legal had weighed in, you were at the gate. I'd seen the photos. Right. And your first call was to legal, and your second call was to the catering facility, and your third when I told you about the post was to pull her credentials before she left the building. You didn't wait for someone to advise you, you just moved. James paused. That's what I mean. Robert said, I've made plenty of decisions I'm not proud of. I'm sure, James said. So have I. But yesterday you made one I could stand behind. That matters to me. A long pause. Then Robert said, What do you need for the statement? Send me a draft by noon. I'll review it and get you my comments by 3. I can do that. Robert. One more thing. Yeah. The catering audit. I want it included in the close conditions. Full review, third party reported to the board. Already drafted it, Robert said. Priya called my office last night. James smiled despite himself. Of course she had. Good, he said. I'll talk to you at 3. He hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of Carol's kitchen, which smelled like coffee and the ghost of last night's pancakes. Through the window, he could see the backyard, small, overgrown in the comfortable way of a yard that belongs to someone who prefers plants to lawn. And beyond the fence, the neighbor's cat sitting on the wall in that self-satisfied way cats have, as if they've arranged the world to their liking and merely tolerate the presence of humans within it. He thought about Sandra Holloway. He thought about what she'd said in that conference room, unlikely to escalate, and how those 2 words, once spoken out loud, had made the rest of the conversation unnecessary because they said everything. Not just about yesterday, about the pattern of it, about the habit of looking at a person and deciding without asking, without wondering what they were worth. He had never wasted much energy being angry at people for underestimating him. Being underestimated, he had found over 2 decades of building something from nothing, was often more useful than being correctly estimated. People who didn't see you clearly were rarely prepared for what you actually did. But there was a difference, and he'd thought about this a lot in the years since Lily was born, in the years of raising her, and thinking about what world he was raising her into. There was a difference between using someone's underestimation as an advantage and simply walking away from it unchanged. The first was practical. The second was a kind of abandonment of the actual problem. The actual problem was that Sandra Holloway had looked at a man and seen a category, not a person. And that problem was not Sandra Holloway's alone. Sandra Holloway was 16 years of an environment that had never once required her to look harder, to ask one more question, to consider that the man in the hoodie might be anything other than what she'd decided. He was not interested in destroying Sandra Holloway, but he was very interested in making sure that the environment she'd worked in for 16 years had to look at itself directly and reckon with what it had produced. That was the thing he'd wanted from the start, not the spectacle, the reckoning. At 11:45, Priya forwarded him a link with a message that said only, "Brace yourself." The link went to a piece published by a mid-size business news outlet, one with a solid reputation and a large enough readership to matter. The headline read, "Who is James Calloway, the quiet CEO behind Pacific Crown's biggest deal and its latest scandal?" The article was thorough. Too thorough to have been assembled overnight. Someone had been working on a profile of James and the acquisition for weeks probably, and had simply found their news peg in yesterday's incident. It covered Apex Freight Systems, the acquisition, James's background. It mentioned Marie. It mentioned Lily, not by name, but as his daughter, whom he has raised alone since his wife's death 12 years ago. He read the part about Marie twice. He sat very still. Then he called Priya. "The outlet," he said. "Who's the reporter?" she told him. He didn't recognize the name. "Did they reach out for comment?" "Yesterday evening. I declined." "Call them back," he said. Tell them I'm not commenting on the incident. But tell them the part about my wife is private, and I'd ask them to consider removing it before the piece gets wider pickup." A pause. "James, legally, they're not required." "I know they're not required," he said. "I'm asking them to consider it, that's all. As a courtesy." "Okay," she said. "I'll call." He put the phone down. He looked at the article for another moment, at the photo they'd used, which was from a conference 2 years ago. James at a podium in a suit that Lily had said made him look like a fancy teacher. And then he closed the browser. There were things he controlled and things he didn't. The article was the second kind. The request was the first kind. He'd made the request. Now he let it go. He picked up his red pen and went back to the acquisition documents. By the time he got to page 40, Priya texted. They agreed, removing the personal section before wider syndication. He read the text. He didn't reply immediately. He set the phone down and looked out the window at the neighbor's cat, which had not moved. He thought, good. He thought, okay. He went back to page 40. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday at 9 a.m. in Pacific Crowns, downtown Los Angeles Tower, 43rd floor, a room with floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides that Robert Hale had always found either inspiring or oppressive, depending on the state of the agenda. This Friday he'd decided before he even walked in it was going to be the second one. He got there at 7:30. The room was empty. He poured himself a coffee from the credenza, stood at the glass, and looked out at the city doing what it always did in the early morning, breathing itself awake, slow and indifferent. The way a city that has survived everything for long enough learns to be indifferent to the thing happening right now, because there is always a thing happening right now. His phone rang. It was Gerald Marsh, No relation to Kathleen, the chairman of Pacific Crown's board, who had been calling Robert at irregular intervals since Tuesday evening and whose calls had grown progressively shorter as the situation grew progressively larger, which Robert had learned to interpret as a bad sign. Gerald was verbose when he was comfortable and terse when he was managing something that frightened him. The calls going from 12 minutes to 4 minutes to 90 seconds over 3 days told Robert everything he needed to know about where Gerald's head was at. "You ready?" Gerald said. "I'm here," Robert said. "That's not what I asked." "I know," Robert said. "Yes, I'm ready." "The Hartwell Group is bringing someone," Gerald said. Hartwell Capital was Pacific Crown's second-largest institutional shareholder and had been making noise since Wednesday morning. "An advisor. They didn't tell me who." "They never do," Robert said. "They're going to push for a delay on the acquisition close." "I know." "Robert." Gerald paused in the way he did before he said something he'd been rehearsing. "I need to know going into this room that the Callaway relationship is solid. I need to know that from you, not from a press release." Robert turned away from the glass. He sat down at the head of the table. He thought about James Callaway in the terminal in a hoodie with a carry-on bag and a phone, and the kind of calm that doesn't come from nothing. It comes from years of building something in the full knowledge that it can be taken away and deciding to build it anyway. "The relationship is solid," Robert said. "He sent me comments on the amended close conditions last night. 11 p.m., 7 pages, all of them reasonable." 7 pages at 11 p.m., Gerald said. "He's thorough," Robert said. "You want a man who's thorough." A pause. "You like him?" "I trust him," Robert said. "Which is more useful." He paused. "Gerald, bring everyone in. Let's get this done." James arrived at the building at 8:55 with Priya and his general counsel, a sharp, quiet woman named Frances Okafor, who had been with Apex Freight for 9 years and who communicated primarily through raised eyebrows and extremely precise sentence construction. Frances had reviewed the amended acquisition conditions 3 times since Wednesday and had 2 pages of handwritten notes that she carried in a manila folder she held against her chest like a shield. In the elevator, Priya said, "Hartwell's in the room." "I know," James said. "They've been vocal," Frances said. "Publicly and presumably privately." "I know," James said. "Their position is that the incident represents reputational risk to the deal," Frances continued, "which is an interesting argument given that the reputational risk originated entirely on Pacific Crown's side of the transaction." "It's not about logic," James said. "It's about fear. Hartwell's investors are nervous. Nervous investors need someone to manage their nerves. That's what this meeting is." The elevator opened. James straightened his jacket. He was in a suit today, charcoal gray, no tie, which Lily had assessed that morning via video call and deemed, "Good, but the collar is wrong, fix the collar, Daddy," and walked into the 43rd floor lobby like a man who had walked into harder rooms than this and come out the other side. The receptionist looked up. James gave her his name. She looked briefly surprised, the micro-expression of someone who has been following a story and suddenly finds themselves 2 feet from the main character, and then recovered professionally and told him Mr. Hale was expecting him. Robert met them at the conference room door. He shook James's hand. Frances's hand nodded to Priya. He looked like a man who had slept approximately 4 hours and was operating on coffee and the specific resolve of someone who knows that what happens in the next 2 hours will define the next several years. "Hartwell brought Marcus Webb," Robert said quietly before they went in. Frances's eyebrow went up. James recognized the name. Marcus Webb was a turnaround specialist, a man whose professional identity was built on coming into troubled situations and recommending clean, decisive action, which in practice usually meant recommending the most conservative possible response to anything that could be characterized as risk. He was effective at what he did. What he did was frequently the wrong thing. "All right," James said. "He's going to argue for a cooling-off period, 90 days minimum before the close." "I know what he's going to argue," James said. Let's go in. The conference room had 11 people in it. James knew 4 of them. He introduced himself to the others with handshakes and eye contact, and the particular ease of a man who has been the only person in the room without a title before and has long since stopped finding it uncomfortable. Marcus Webb was 63, silver-haired, with the handshake of a man who had decided decades ago that a firm grip was a form of argument. He shook James's hand and said, "James Calloway, Marcus Webb. I've followed Apex Freight for a while." "I know who you are," James said pleasantly. Something flickered in Webb's expression, not quite surprise, but a slight recalibration. "Then you know I'm here in an advisory capacity, nothing adversarial." "Of course," James said. "Nothing about this needs to be adversarial." They sat. Robert opened the meeting with 15 minutes of structured review. The incident, the response, the timeline, the legal status, the public coverage, the current acquisition position. He was thorough and precise and didn't editorialize, which James appreciated. Facts, chronology, current state. Clean. Then Gerald Marsh said, "Marcus, you've had a chance to review everything. What's your read?" Webb leaned forward. He spoke with the measured pace of a man who has learned that speaking slowly makes people listen harder. "The exposure here isn't the food," he said. "Everyone in this room knows the food is manageable. It's a catering error. It's been addressed. It's over. The exposure is the narrative. The acquisition is now publicly linked to a discrimination allegation." "There's been no allegation," Frances said. Her voice was quiet and exact. "No filing, no claim, no charge." Webb looked at her. "Perception, Ms. Okafor. And perception is managed by action, not by delay." Webb continued, as if she hadn't spoken, which James noted. "The perception, whether fair or not, is that Pacific Crown has a culture problem, and a culture problem at the target company when it becomes associated with the acquiring company creates a liability that—" "Marcus." James spoke for the first time since the presentation started. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift in his seat. He simply said the name in a tone that indicated he was about to say something that would be worth listening to, and the room did what rooms do. When someone speaks with that particular quality of assurance, it got slightly quieter. "You're describing a scenario," James said, "in which I am harmed by the actions taken against me. I'd like to address that directly, because it seems relevant that I am the person who was in seat 2A and I am the person who is choosing to proceed with this acquisition. And if I have determined that Pacific Crown Airlines is still worth acquiring, then the people in this room who have not sat in that seat might consider why my position and their position are different." Webb was quiet. "I'm not proceeding out of sentiment," James continued. "I'm proceeding because Robert Hale was at that gate before he knew the full scope of the situation, because his team moved faster and cleaner than most companies move when they've had a week to prepare, and because the amended close conditions which I sent back at 11 last night and which are in front of you in your folders include a full independent audit of catering operations that will make this kind of failure structurally impossible to repeat." He paused. "A 90-day delay doesn't fix a culture problem. A properly structured acquisition with the right oversight conditions does. That is what we have negotiated. I am asking this board to let us finish what we started." The room was quiet. Robert was looking at the table, but James could see from the angle of his jaw that he was working very hard not to show what he was feeling. Gerald Marsh said, "Marcus?" Webb looked at James for a long moment. The look of a man recalibrating in real time, updating an assessment he'd formed before he walked into the room, and finding, not without some grudging respect, that the update was significant. "My concerns are on record," Webb said, "for the board's consideration." "Noted," Gerald said. He looked around the table. "All right, let's vote." The vote took 4 minutes. 9-2 in favor of proceeding. The 2 dissenting votes were both from Hartwell's representatives, which was expected and had been calculated into the margin before anyone sat down. Robert shook James's hand when it was done. Not the terminal handshake, not the agreement handshake, but the kind that means we actually did it, which has a different weight to it, a different warmth. "Thank you," Robert said. "Thank Frances," James said. "She's the one who put 'structurally impossible to repeat' in my notes at 10:30 last night." Frances, who was already packing her manila folder with the efficiency of someone who considers celebration a second-order priority to documentation, said without looking up, "You're both welcome." Outside in the elevator going down, Priya said, "Webb is going to write a piece about this." "Probably," James said. "His pieces tend to be ungenerous." "I know." "It won't affect the close," Frances said. The elevator doors opened. "It will affect precisely nothing." "That's what I thought," James said. In the lobby, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and stopped walking. It was a text from a number he didn't have saved. It said, "Mr. Calloway. My name is Sandra Holloway. I got your number from a mutual contact in the industry. I understand if you don't respond. I only wanted to say that I am sorry, not because of the consequences, because of what I did and why I did it. You didn't deserve that. Your daughter's drawing was in the seat pocket. I put it in lost and found. I hope they got it back to you." He read it twice. Priya said, "James' car's outside." He held up one finger. He read the message a third time. He thought about what it cost someone to send a message like that. Not the logistics of finding a number, but the actual interior cost of sitting down and typing it out after everything that had happened, when the consequences were already in motion, and there was nothing to be gained from reaching out, and everything to be lost if it went badly. He thought about Lily saying, but also kind of sad at the kitchen table in mismatched socks. He put the phone in his pocket and walked to the car. Priya, who had learned over 7 years not to ask about the things he put in his pocket, said nothing. He sat in the back of the car. He took the phone out again. He looked at the message. He typed a reply, not long, not elaborate, the way he did everything when something required precision rather than volume. "Ms. Holloway. They got the drawing back. I appreciate you sending this. I hope you find what comes next." He hit send. He put the phone away. He looked out the window at the city. Nishal. Sandra Holloway read the reply 4 times in her kitchen, at the table where she'd been sitting for most of the past 3 days because there wasn't anywhere she particularly needed to be. The termination had been processed. The union had reviewed her case and come back with an assessment that matched almost exactly what Kathleen Marsh had told her in the conference room. The documentation was thorough. The post was unambiguous. The acknowledgement she'd made in the meeting had closed the most viable avenues for dispute. They weren't abandoning her, but they were honest with her, which was both more and less than she'd wanted. She'd spent 3 days reading things about herself on the internet, which she knew she should stop doing and couldn't. Most of it was what she expected: the outrage, the commentary, the people who had decided she represented everything wrong with everything. Some of it was more specific than she could handle on certain hours of certain days, and she'd had to put the phone down and walk into the other room and breathe. One piece from a smaller outlet had taken a different angle, not sympathetic exactly, but interested. It asked about systems rather than individuals. It asked what kind of environment produces a person who makes a calculation like the one Sandra had made and does so automatically without awareness, and then posts about it publicly without considering for a moment that it might be wrong. It was a piece that made Sandra deeply uncomfortable, which she'd come to understand was different from a piece that was unfair. She looked at James Calloway's reply. "I hope you find what comes next." Not forgiveness. She hadn't asked for that, and he hadn't offered it, and she respected the precision of that boundary. Not coldness either. Just acknowledgement. The bare minimum of human recognition extended across everything that had happened. She sat with it for a while. Then she opened her laptop and started looking at what it would take to get a real estate license in California. She'd thought about it years ago before she'd committed to the airline, and then she'd put it away because the airline was good and stable, and she'd been good at it. She was 51 years old. She had savings. She had 16 years of handling difficult people in enclosed spaces under pressure, which was arguably better preparation for real estate than most people would think. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know what the next year would look like or the year after that. But she was done deciding she knew things before she'd asked a single question. The story had one more chapter that James hadn't anticipated, though perhaps he should have. It came on a Thursday afternoon, 12 days after the flight, in the form of a call from a woman named Dr. Angela Reyes, who ran a nonprofit focused on workplace bias training for aviation and hospitality companies, and who had, in her own words, been watching this situation very carefully. "I'm not calling to put you in an uncomfortable position," Dr. Reyes said. She had the voice of someone who spent a lot of time in rooms where trust had to be built from scratch. "I know you've declined press. I respect that. I'm calling because what happened on that flight, the specific mechanics of it, the way the bias operated, the way it was so automatic that she posted about it without any apparent awareness that it was wrong. That is almost a textbook case for what we try to teach." James was in his actual office for the first time in 2 weeks behind his actual desk, which Lily had once described as the place where paper goes to wait forever. He looked at the stacks of documents and thought that she wasn't wrong. "What are you asking me?" he said. "Nothing yet," Dr. Reyes said. "I'm telling you something first. The catering error would have been news for a day. What made it last, what made people actually sit with it, wasn't the mold. It was the post. Because the post showed the thinking. And the thinking is what most people recognize either from experiencing it or from having had it themselves, even if they'd never posted on the internet." "You're right," James said. "I know I'm right," she said, not unkindly. "What I want to know is whether you'd be willing to speak at our annual conference in the spring. Not about the incident, about what you've built, how you built it, the part where you talk to your daughter about what it means to be steady when someone has decided you're not worth steadiness." A pause. "I read the piece in the Business Journal. The journalist who wrote it is a good one. She quoted you as saying, 'I only control what I do.' People underline things like that." James leaned back in his chair. He thought about the protein bar. He thought about the red pen and the acquisition documents. He thought about Lily at the kitchen table, doing fractions, turning the TV off without looking up. "When's the conference?" he asked. "April," Dr. Reyes said. "Chicago." "Send me the details," he said. "I'll look at my schedule." "That's all I'm asking," she said. He hung up and sat quietly for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and texted Lily, because she was in school, but he knew she checked her phone between classes when the teacher wasn't looking, and some things couldn't wait for the right time. He wrote, "Thinking about you. Hard fractions. First remember." 3 minutes passed. Then Daddy. "I'm in class." He smiled. Typed, "I know. Love you." Another minute. Then a single emoji, a small red heart. The one she always used, the one she'd been using since she was 8 years old, and first discovered that a heart could be sent through a phone. He set the phone down. He picked up the red pen. He went back to work. Pacific Crown Airlines and Apex Freight Systems announced the formal close of the acquisition on a Monday morning in November in a press conference on the 43rd floor of the Pacific Crown Tower, with floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, and the city of Los Angeles spread out below like something that had been waiting patiently for something to begin. Robert Hale spoke first. He talked about the future of the company, the integration timeline, the workforce commitments, the catering audit that had already been completed and whose findings had resulted in a complete restructuring of the airline's ground services contracts. He was precise and comprehensive and spoke without notes, which James had noticed was the way Robert always operated when he was confident in what he was saying. Then James spoke. He was brief. He thanked his team, Francis Priya, the people at Apex Freight who had worked through the summer and fall to make the numbers work. He said one thing about the future that he wanted on record, because Priya had asked him to say something, and because he'd thought about it long enough that he knew how to say it simply. I started Apex Freight with one truck and a contract that most people told me wasn't going to hold, he said. The lesson of that and of everything since is that what you build is only as solid as how you treat the people you don't have to treat well. The people you could dismiss. The people you could overlook. That's where the real measure is. Not in the boardroom, not in the press release. He paused. We intend to be measured correctly. There were questions from the journalists in the room. He answered 4 of them and declined 2 cleanly and without explanation, which was his right and which he exercised without apology. Afterward, in the hallway, Robert walked with him toward the elevator and said, "Good statement." "Frances wrote the bones of it," James said. "She wrote the bones. You said it like you meant it." "I did mean it," James said. "I know." Robert stopped at the elevator. "James, for what it's worth, I think about that gate sometimes. Being there before I knew the full scope, I don't know if I would have moved that fast if I'd had more time to think about it." James looked at him. "That's why you moved that fast," he said, "because you didn't have time to talk yourself out of the right thing." The elevator arrived. Robert nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing something away for future reference. "Safe travels," he said. "Same to you," James said. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. He was alone in the mirrored space of it, going down the city, rising around him in reflection on all sides, and he looked at himself for a moment. The suit, the collar, Lily had told him to fix the face of a man who had been on a flight 3 months ago and eaten a protein bar and made a phone call and waited, and he thought, as he often did in the unobserved moments between one thing and the next, about Marie. He thought about what she would have said. He thought she would have said something funny. First, she always led with something funny. It was the thing he missed most, that reflex of hers to find the absurd angle before settling into the serious one. And then, she would have said something true. She was very good at saying things that were true. He thought she probably would have said, "You didn't do it to prove anything. That's why it worked." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. He walked out into the city. Spring came to Chicago the way it always does, reluctantly. In fits and starts, a warm Tuesday, followed by a cold Thursday, the city refusing to commit to anything until it was absolutely ready. By the time James Calloway landed at O'Hare on the second Friday of April, the trees along Michigan Avenue were finally doing what they'd been threatening to do for weeks, and the city had the specific loosened quality of a place that had been holding its breath through a long winter and had just decided collectively to let it go. He traveled lighter than usual. One carry-on. His red pen. A folder of notes that Priya had prepared and that he had not opened on the flight because he'd spent the 2 hours from LA reading a novel Lily had recommended, a fantasy about a girl who could talk to rivers, which was not his usual genre, but which Lily had placed in his bag with the instruction, "Read it and report back. I need someone to discuss this with," and which he had somewhere over Nevada found genuinely absorbing. He was met at the airport by a graduate student named Owen, who worked for Dr. Reyes's nonprofit, and who was 23 years old and deeply visibly nervous in the way of someone who has been assigned to collect a person they've read about and isn't sure what version of that person is going to come through the arrivals door. James shook his hand and said, "How far is the hotel?" And Owen said, 20 minutes, sir, maybe 30 with traffic." And James said, "Don't call me sir. It makes me feel like I've done something wrong." And Owen laughed a real laugh, the tension going out of him all at once, and after that, they were fine. In the car, Owen said, "Dr. Reyes wanted me to tell you the keynote runs 45 minutes, and then there's a 30-minute Q&A if you want it, but she said it's entirely your call, and nobody will be upset if you'd prefer to keep it shorter." 45 minutes is fine, James said, "and I'll take the Q&A." Owen glanced at him from the driver's seat. "Can I ask, what are you going to talk about?" James thought about it for a moment. "I'm going to talk about a protein bar," he said. Owen waited, clearly expecting more. When more didn't come, he nodded slowly and said, "Okay," in the tone of someone who has decided to trust the process. Dr. Angela Reyes was exactly what her voice had suggested. A woman who had spent years building trust in rooms where it didn't exist naturally, who moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who never mistook efficiency for urgency. She was 58, sharp-eyed, with the handshake of a person who understood that a handshake was actually a sentence. "I'm glad you came," she said when Owen brought James to the green room behind the main conference hall. "I want to be honest with you. We've had speakers cancel on this event for smaller reasons. The fact that you're here matters to the people in that room." "How many?" James asked. 412 registered. Airline industry, hospitality, corporate HR, some academic researchers. She paused. "And about 60 people who work in aviation, and reached out specifically because of what happened on Flight 887. Frontline workers, cabin crew, gate agents." Another pause. "People who recognized something in the story." James looked at her. "Recognized which part?" Dr. Reyes looked back at him steadily. "Both parts," she said. "The part that happened to you, and the part they might have done themselves on a bad day in a tired year, after too many flights and too many passengers, and a system that never once asked them to look harder." She paused. "That's the conversation I'm hoping you'll be willing to have. Not the comfortable version, the actual one." James was quiet for a moment. "That's the one I came to have," he said. He walked onto the stage at 9:45 to the kind of applause that is warm but watchful. An audience that was glad he was there, and also waiting to see who he was going to be in person now that the story was over and the man was standing in front of them. He stood at the podium for a moment without speaking, which was not a technique or a performance. He just stood there in his charcoal suit with the collar correctly adjusted and looked at the room and let the room look back. Then he said, "I want to tell you about the worst meal I've ever been served at 35,000 feet." Someone laughed. The room relaxed fractionally. "It smelled before I even lifted the lid," he said. "Mold on the chicken. Whatever was happening to the spinach, I'd rather not describe in detail." Another small laugh. "I didn't say anything to anyone. I didn't call for the attendant. I didn't ask for a supervisor. I took pictures. I sent an email. And I ate a protein bar that my 12-year-old daughter had told me to always pack because, and I'm quoting directly, airline food is disgusting. Daddy always bring a backup." He paused. She was right. She usually is. The room was with him now. He could feel it, that particular quality of attention that is different from polite listening, that comes when people decide you're telling them something real. "I'm not here to talk about what happened to the flight attendant who served me that meal," he said. "That's been written about extensively, and whatever conclusions people have drawn, they've drawn without much input from me, which was intentional. I'm here to talk about something that I think is actually more interesting than the incident itself. I'm here to talk about the moment before the incident. The moment when a person looks at another person and makes a decision, fast, automatic, below the level of conscious thought about what that person is worth." He stepped away from the podium. He didn't like podiums. They put distance between him and the thing he was trying to say. "She looked at me," he said, "and she saw someone she didn't need to worry about. She didn't decide this maliciously. She didn't sit down and think it through. She just looked. And what she saw confirmed something she already believed, something the environment she'd worked in for 16 years had never once challenged, because the environment didn't require her to look harder. The environment rewarded her for being efficient. And efficiency, when it's applied to people, has a way of becoming something else entirely." He looked at the section of the audience that Owen had mentioned, the frontline workers, the cabin crew. They were listening with a particular quality, the way people listen when they're doing two things at once, hearing the words and checking them against their own experience, testing for accuracy. "I'm not talking about her," he said directly. "I'm talking about the system that produced the moment, and I'm talking about myself because I want to be honest with you about something." He paused. "I have done this. Not on a plane, not in a uniform, but I have looked at a person and made a fast decision about what they were worth, and I have been wrong, and it has cost me something real. I know what that moment feels like from the inside. It doesn't feel like bias. It feels like reading the room. The room was very quiet. The difference between me and the moment on that plane, he continued, is not that I'm a better person. It's that I had a bad year when I was 26 that required me to sit on the receiving end of that moment over and over in every room I walked into and understand what it actually was. I was starting a freight company with one truck and a contract that 3 banks had declined to finance. I walked into a lot of rooms in a hoodie because I didn't own a suit that fit yet. I watched people make calculations about me. He paused, and I took notes. The laugh this time was different, not tension release, but recognition. The laugh of people who had been in rooms like that or knew someone who had. I took notes, he said again more quietly. Not out of anger, out of education. I was learning something that you cannot learn any other way, that the person you dismiss is writing the next chapter of a story you don't know you're in. He let that sit. I named my company Apex because I wanted to build something that started at the bottom of the mountain and was headed somewhere specific. Not because I had something to prove to anyone in particular, but because I understood by then that the most dangerous thing you can do in any industry is decide you already know who belongs in which room. He paused. The cost of that mistake eventually always lands somewhere real. The Q&A ran 35 minutes, which was 5 minutes over the allotted time, and which Dr. Reyes extended without hesitation because the room was still asking questions, and the questions were good ones, not softballs, not the performative kind that are really statements dressed up with a question mark at the end, but actual questions from people who were working through something. A woman in the 3rd row who introduced herself as a regional manager for a mid-size carrier said, "How do you build a culture where people are required to look harder when the entire operational model is built on speed and efficiency? When slowing down to actually see the person in front of you is by the system's definition a failure?" "You build it from the top," James said. "Not by mandate, by behavior. The people in your organization are watching what you do when no one thinks they're watching. They are always watching. If the message from leadership, implicit or explicit, is that efficiency matters more than accuracy, then the people at the front lines will be efficient at the expense of accuracy every single time, because that's what survival in the environment requires." He paused. "You change what the environment rewards. That's the only lever that actually works." A man near the back, older with the bearing of someone who had been in the industry a long time, said, "Respectfully, Mr. Calloway, there are people in this room who think the coverage of this incident went too far. That one mistake, even a significant one, shouldn't have been career-ending. How do you respond to that?" The room shifted slightly. James looked at the man directly. "I think that's a legitimate question," he said. "And I want to be honest about my role in the answer. I didn't ask for her termination. I asked for accountability. The termination was a decision made by the airline based on the totality of what she did, the food and the post, and what she said in the meeting about why she'd made the call she made." He paused. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that 16 years of good work should count for nothing. I don't believe that. But I also can't tell you that 16 years of good work is a reason to continue in a position that requires you to see every passenger as a full human being if the evidence suggests that capacity has significant gaps." He paused again. "What I will say is this: she sent me a message. After everything. She apologized, and the apology was honest. I could tell the difference. I wrote back. I wished her well. I meant it." A beat. Whatever comes next for her is her chapter to write. I'm not the author of it. The man in the back nodded slowly. Not agreement necessarily, but something. A young woman near the front, mid-20s, the kind of alert stillness that comes from paying very close attention, said, "You mentioned your daughter a few times. What does she know about all of this?" The room warmed slightly at the question, the way rooms do when something personal enters them. "Everything," James said. "She's 12. She reads, She found the business journal piece before I could show it to her. He paused. We talked about it for about an hour one evening after dinner. She asked me why I hadn't been angrier. I told her that anger was useful for about 30 seconds, and then it became a thing you were carrying instead of a tool you were using. She thought about it and said, "Is that why you always seem tired?" He smiled, which was fair. I told her the tiredness was more about the quarterly reports. The room laughed. Real laughter this time, the whole room, and it released something. She also said something I keep thinking about, James added. He hadn't planned to say this part. It arrived the way the true things always did without warning. She said, "Daddy, do you think that lady knew she was doing it?" And I said, "I think she thought she was reading the room." And Lily said, He stopped for a moment because the specific quality of Lily's voice when she'd said it had stayed with him, that particular 12-year-old precision that arrived sometimes like a gift. That's the scariest kind of wrong, when it feels exactly like being right. The room was silent. "Yeah," James said. "She's going to be okay." Okay. He had dinner with Dr. Reyes that evening at a small restaurant 2 blocks from the hotel that she said she'd been going to for 20 years, and where the owner knew her order. They sat at a corner table and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with the conference, about the nonprofit's origins, about her daughter, who was a civil engineer in Portland, about the novel James had been reading on the plane, which Dr. Reyes had also read and had opinions about that were sharp and specific, and occasionally completely wrong, which they argued about in the comfortable way of 2 people who have decided within the first 20 minutes of dinner that the conversation is worth having fully. At the end of the evening, when the check had been settled and they were putting on their coats, Dr. Reyes said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," James said. "I'll tell you if I can't answer it." "Do you think it was worth it? Not the acquisition, not the accountability, just all of it. The way it grew, the way it became public, the way it became a story bigger than what actually happened." James thought about this. He thought about the protein bar. He thought about Lily's drawing in The Lost and Found. He thought about Sandra Holloway's message. "I hope they got it back to you," and the cost he could feel in those 7 words, the interior cost of sending them. He thought about Owen in the airport car, laughing when James told him not to call him sir. He thought about Robert at the gate moving fast because he didn't have time to talk himself out of the right thing. He thought about Frances with her manila folder, and Priya at 11 p.m. drafting amendments, and the man in the back of the conference room asking the hard question because it needed to be asked. He thought about Marie, who would have said something funny first. "I didn't set out for it to be a story," he said. "I set out to do the right thing in the moment in front of me, which was document the food, contact the right person, and eat the protein bar." He paused. Everything else followed from that. And yes, if everything that followed resulted in a room of 400 people asking better questions about how they look at the person in front of them, then yes, it was worth it. He paused once more. "I just want to be careful that I get credit for the thing I actually did, which was make a phone call. The story did the rest of the work." Dr. Reyes looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing any speaker has said to me in 22 years of running this organization." "Then the bar is lower than I thought," he said. She laughed. "Good night, James." "Good night, Dr. Reyes." He called Lily from the hotel room at 9:45 Chicago time, which was 7:45 in Los Angeles, which was the window between dinner and homework, where she was always reachable and always talkative. She answered on the first ring. "How was Chicago?" "Cold," he said. "Then warm, then cold again." "That's just Chicago, Daddy. That's not a weather report." "The conference was good," he said. "I talked about you." A pause. "What did you say?" "I said you were going to be okay." Another pause, shorter. "That's it. That's the important part." He could hear her thinking about this, the specific quality of Lily's silence, which was never actually silence, but a kind of active processing that she'd had since she was 3 years old, when she used to stand in the middle of the kitchen floor and stare at something that wasn't there while she worked something out. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah. I've been thinking about that lady, the flight attendant." "Have you?" I looked her up. Not like her personal stuff, just what happened, what she's doing now. A pause. There was an article, a small one. She's getting a real estate license. James sat down on the edge of the hotel bed. "I know. You knew? I heard something along those lines." "Do you think she'll be good at it?" Lily asked. And the way she asked it, not as a judgment, not as a test, but as a genuine question. The kind that comes from actual curiosity about what becomes of people. Made something in James's chest do the specific thing it did. Sometimes the thing without a good name, that was not quite sadness and not quite pride, and was more like an awareness of time passing and the person in front of him growing into something real. "I think she might be," he said. "She's good at reading people. She just needs to do it more carefully." Lily was quiet for a moment. "That's kind of what you said about the bias thing, that it feels like reading the room when it's actually something else." "You read the piece," he said. "I told you, I read everything." A beat. "I'm not supposed to have news apps, but Aunt C's tablet doesn't have restrictions." "I'll be speaking to Aunt C," he said. "She said you'd say that, and she said to tell you good luck." He smiled. He lay back on the hotel bed, still in his suit, looking at the ceiling of a hotel room in Chicago on a Friday night in April. 44 years old, the city outside, and his daughter's voice in his ear. And he felt not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for something this layered. He felt like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be, in every sense of that phrase. "Did you finish the book?" Lily asked. "I finished it on the plane." "And?" "The ending surprised me," he said. "Good surprise or bad surprise?" He thought about it. The girl who talked to rivers, the thing she'd understood at the end about why the rivers spoke back to her, not because she was special, but because she had learned through everything the book put her through to be still enough to hear. "Good surprise," he said. "The kind that makes you go back and reread the beginning." "That's my favorite kind," Lily said with the authority of someone who has decided opinions about narrative structure at the age of 12 and intends to defend them. "Okay, I have to do homework. Come home tomorrow." "Tomorrow afternoon," he said. "I'll be there for dinner." "I'm making pancakes again." "You're making pancakes for dinner." "They're a complete food, Daddy. They have eggs and flour, and that covers basically everything." "That is not—" He stopped. "We'll discuss the nutritional philosophy of pancakes when I get home." "Okay, love you." "Love you too, baby." She hung up. He lay there for a moment in the quiet of the hotel room, phone resting on his chest, looking at nothing. He thought about the flight. He thought about the lid coming off the tray, and the smell, and the 4 seconds he'd sat there before he reached for his phone. He thought about the way time worked in a moment like that, how a thing that lasted 4 seconds could become the fixed point that everything else in the following months organized itself around the way. A small stone dropped into still water sends rings outward until they touch every edge. He had dropped the stone by making a phone call. The rings had done the rest. He thought about what he'd said to Dr. Reyes. "I set out to do the right thing in the moment in front of me." He thought about how simple that sentence was, and how much practice it had taken to make it simple. 20 years of practice. One truck, one contract, one room at a time. Lily asking him questions he hadn't thought to ask himself. Marie saying things that were true. Carol talking for 3 hours in a hospital hallway so the silence didn't crush him. Priya at 11 p.m. every p.m. drafting things that needed to be drafted. Frances with her raised eyebrow and her manila folder quietly making the impossible structurally impossible to repeat. He had not built any of this alone. He had never built anything alone. The hoodie and the quiet and the protein bar had made it look like solitude, But solitude was never the point. The point was being present enough in the moment you were actually in to do the one right thing that the moment required. He sat up. He took off his jacket. He hung it carefully over the desk chair the way Lily had told him to, instead of throwing it on the suitcase like he always did at home. He took out his red pen. He opened the folder of notes Priya had prepared, the one he hadn't opened on the plane, because he'd been reading about rivers. He read for an hour. He made notes in the margins in small, precise handwriting. He corrected 2 things and confirmed 16 others, and added 1 question at the bottom of the last page that he wanted to think about more before answering. At 11, he put the pen down. He turned off the light. In the dark, in the quiet of a hotel room in Chicago in April, the city breathing outside the window, James Calloway thought about his daughter's pancakes and the correct arrangement of a suit jacket, and whether the girl in the novel would ever stop needing the rivers to tell her what she already knew. He thought about a crayon drawing in blue and green and orange mailed back to him in a padded envelope with a Pacific Crown return address, which now lived on his desk at home, under a small glass paperweight that Lily had given him 2 Christmases ago, and which she periodically moved to different spots on the desk. For energy purposes, a practice he did not understand, and had chosen not to question. He thought, "Come home soon." He thought, "I am." He closed his eyes. He slept without difficulty, the way a man sleeps when he has done what was in front of him to do. Not everything, never everything, because everything is not a thing any one person can do, but the right thing in the right moment without drama and without apology, and then let what followed follow. Some people look at a room and see the people they expect to find there. Some people look at a room and see what's actually there. The distance between those 2 ways of seeing is the whole of it, the whole of what goes right and what goes wrong in business and in families and in the country, as it tries imperfectly and often badly to understand itself. James Calloway had learned to see what was actually there. It had cost him something to learn it. It had also given him everything worth keeping. And in the end, that is what quiet men build, when they finally decide to build. Not noise, not spectacle, not the kind of story that announces itself. They build something that stands after the cameras turn away, and the trending topics cycle through to the next thing, and the terminal empties, and the flight becomes just another entry in a departure log that no one reads. They build something that lasts,